Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. The Philosophical Angle program is to analyze the nature and essence of concepts being used in current media. And this week, we're going to analyze terrorism, as it's been in the news quite a bit lately. And we're going to possibly analyze how to prevent it. So our concept is terror, particularly Islamic terror, and the application is how to prevent it. Well, in order for us to really understand the very basic essence of this topic, we really should probably define terror. And what is it? Okay, so let's bring something forth here. Terror is the extreme fear of losing something that is good to us, that accrues to our benefit. So here I've written down extreme fear is of losing much goodness that we possess. And that goodness is wrapped up in our lives, our livelihood, our assets, and all the things that are good for us and accrues to our betterment. And it's just a matter of degree from when it goes from fear to terror. That which is the betterment increases and becomes closer and more and is dear to us, the fear can grow into terror. So things that can produce terror is jeopardy of our lives, or and we see that as we see examples of terror in the news when Islamic terrorism is spread to Brussels and to other places and kills many people. So really, the world should be facing a particular question as to how to prevent it. It is such a terrible thing. Well, in order to really confront the problem, whether it's on a personal nature, whether your life is in danger, like in the midst of a battle with cancer, or whether it's a nation up against a great enemy, you have to declare war against it. You have to decide that you want to defeat whatever it is before you that's producing your fear that has really grown into a situation of terror. And I don't think this nation has done that yet. So in order for this nation to really conquer the problem of terrorism, it really has to formally declare war against it. And I don't know that it has really truly. The present administration can't even say the words Islamic terror. So if we were to declare war, what is the nature of war? How do we understand that? Well, obviously, war is a type of aggression, and why do we create war? Why do we use aggression? Well, it's because for somebody's benefit, war is started, and to whom can that betterment accrue? Well, war is decided by totalitarians, such as in the old times. The king pretty much had the decision as to whether to make war on a neighboring country or a people or whatever. Also, Republican government type countries have declared war. Usually it's in response to an aggressive action by somebody else, but we have declared war in our past. And so you have to consider, when making a declaration of war, what is the risk versus reward ratio? And this is really a key important part of the analysis here, because it's very different from a king or a totalitarian regime which declares a war, because the risk to the king is not much, and because of his concentration of power, he can make the decision almost by himself, and he stays in the back, so his life is not in jeopardy. And so the risk-reward ratio is very different from a country with a Republican government, because a Republican government has a decision-making process that is spread throughout society. And so it must think of the people. And if the power is diffused, and the decision-making power is diffused, it will take time for the decision to be made, and there'll be much debate about it. Whereas in with the king, he can make it quickly because his power is concentrated, and it's easy for him to declare war, as he's really the only person that needs to be in the decision-making process. And so an oligarchy is not far from that. And so the impetus to declare war is really how much benefit comes to the king, because his risk is not as great as that which is for the people. So his sacrifice is little, and his reward is pretty good. It can be good if he wins. So for him, it's a pretty good ratio. But in a less concentrated government of power, the people have some risk, because they're the ones that go and fight it. And so since they have an input in there, that decision-making process is a little bit more diverse. And thus the risk versus reward ratio is slightly different in a Republican type of government. And so the risk is high for the people, and so the sacrifice is great, and the reward is not so good. So it's a bad choice. War is usually a bad choice for Republican and for the people of a country. So you have to declare it with only with dire circumstances before us. Well, let's take a look at the Islamic countries, and those countries that are these are the countries that are producing terror, and those countries against whom a declaration of war or against a declaration of a war against terror needs to be declared, because it is terror is coming out of Islam, and it's because that their society are generally totalitarian, and they're totalitarian, and in some cases an oligarch, but in all cases it's a theocracy. And this leads to a totalitarian style government governed by Sharia law, which is made from the Sunnah, from the Hadith, and from the Quran, and from the Jewish jurisprudence that comes from Islamic scholars that make decisions upon the various types of documents that control this religion. And from that, they've deduced that there's an ideological Islam that has deduced that they need to attack the West, and it's from right out of the Quran. You shall strike terror in the hearts of the unbelievers, and so they're ready to sacrifice everything to produce the reward of bringing Islam to the world. So if we want to stop terrorism against such a Islamic ideology that's being produced in the Middle East, we need to declare war. And so if you're going to declare war, why don't we take a little advice from those of the past who have studied war. And one of them that I'd like to bring forth is probably the most famous of all, from China. He wrote a book called The Art of War, and it was by Sun Tsu. And his first rule: if you know your enemy and you know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. So we need to know our enemy, and to know the enemy, we need to at least study the Quran, which is the source of all the ideology that comes out of the Middle East. In addition to the Quran, there's the Hadith, which are the traditional sayings of Muhammad. They are not the sayings that were produced to the Prophet Muhammad through from the angel Gabriel, but it is the what he was saying in his daily life, which supplements the Quran. So the next one in the art of war that I think is relevant here, that we should study, that we should use to decide what we should do in going against the terror that is being brought forth from the Middle East. And that is, to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. And we come back to what we discussed a little bit before, that we don't want to create too big a sacrifice, because the people have to do the fighting. So we want to control that, and Sun Tsu confirms that in this expression here: to subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. And the next one we want to use from the art of war: there is no nation that benefits from prolonged warfare. Boy, isn't that the truth? And democracies have trouble with long wars. After a while, the people get tired, and they want to end it. And further, without warfare, what can we do? How could we uphold the principles of war? So, in our quest in understanding how to go against terror. So I'm going to give some solutions which are relevant to these passages from the Art of War. And lastly, we should bring forth: the enemy, the expert in battle, moves the enemy and is not moved by him. And because of this last one, I think that we need to bring the battle to the Middle East. Take it away from the prevention of the fighting it here locally, or in Paris locally, or in Brussels locally, and you need to take it to where the enemy is, and following this dictum of Sun Tsu. So here they are. Let's put these up and see how they would fly. First, we need to freeze international payments and stop all money transfers out of the Middle East, all which are tinted of war, tinted of terrorism. Stop private contributions to the Islamic State, which I understand to be about 40 million a year right now. Capture the oil fields, and keep and give away the revenue from those oil fields, either to nonprofit situations over in the Middle East, to our friends and allies there, or keep it for ourselves. After all, it's war. Make a fort around the oil fields in the Islamic State. So we're not going after all the oil fields, just the ones in the Islamic State which are producing the vast amount of terror so far. Should make an Israeli type of iron dome around our fort there, a self-defense shield and an anti-missile shield. Build a fast attack, nimble force there that is able to destroy the government of the Islamic State or attack it at a moment's notice. It doesn't have to be very large. It can be the Air Force, and then can send out their planes, and the Army can send out their attack helicopters, and then come back to our fort. We need to send weapons to those that are enemies of the Islamic State in the Middle East and who are willing to support and cooperate on our side, such as the Kurds. Establish that fort, and then to put inside that fort a radio and TV station making critical evaluations of Islam and the Islamic State and broadcasting that throughout the Middle East, counteracting the propaganda that's coming out of the Islamic State. And of course, continue our bombing sorties. So I think that these recommendations to stop terrorism are good because they take the battle into the proximity of the enemy itself. It'll cause them to focus attention on their own geographical area as opposed to ours. And the sacrifice-reward ratio, I think, is a good one. It's not sending a large army, a lot of boots on the ground, as it were. And the ratio is the reward here is the cessation of terror. So I think that's these choices would be a good start to creating a detriment to or creating an anti-force to the establishment of terror in the West. But I've spoken enough. Let's bring in our co-host, Remy Canario. Remy, good to see you.
Nice to see you, Chris.
And Rick Samuelson. Rick?
Hi, good to see you.
Guys, what do you think about all this? What do you think? How can we stop terror coming out of the Middle East and coming into the Western Hemisphere? Who would like to go first?
One issue that we absolutely must contend with is the fact that operations of terror in the West are not dramatically high-cost, high-skill sorties for the Islamic State. I mean, particularly because they're choosing soft targets like the Bataclan in Paris, like an airport in Brussels. These are by definition low cost and high reward operations for them, and so I do not exactly see how such drastic steps as building forts around the oil fields would impact their ability to launch these kinds of attacks in the West, considering that a branch of Al Qaeda like AQAP, based in Yemen, was able to put together the Charlie Hebdo attacks without any kind of resources along the lines of what we're talking about. We're talking about an all-out offensive against the Islamic State. That's a different thing, and it's possible that those steps could potentially lead to a better situation. But that would be a very different choice, and one in which we would have to take into account the extent to which actually putting our forces on the ground and bringing the fight to ISIS serves to legitimize them and their apocalyptic creed, which sees an end of days kind of final showdown between good and evil happening in the land of Syria. So when it comes to actually preventing terror in the West, I don't think that we're actually doing, at least in the United States, anything that's that far from what we can do, which is a campaign of air raids, which have been very successful recently. We've seen the death of not only the Minister of War, who was responsible for many of ISIS's most impressive battlefield successes, but also the Islamic State's heir apparent, and all of that in the past 2 or 3 weeks. And I think that there is good reason to believe that after a certain amount of time of setting up the infrastructure of information and informants that is needed to get the most out of airstrikes, there's reason to believe that those successes will continue. Additionally, we have to be sure that we use every piece of intelligence capability that we have at our disposal against both threats of terror emanating from Syria itself and from the threats that of locally grown terror that's inspired by the Islamic State over the web. We must use every tool available because that is an extremely difficult threat to fight, and if we are held back by overly cautious sense of privacy, that is a recipe for more victims. But otherwise, the State Department does engage in counter messaging. It just hasn't proved all that successful. Those 2 ingredients: the air battle and using the tools that our intelligence services have available, are really the only 2 pieces of puzzle that are going to make a difference, I believe.
Rick?
Well, I think on the one hand, the hands of the United States are a bit tied. What the European governments are doing currently is incompetent, demonstrably incompetent. Their ability to locate terrorists, anticipate attacks, is catastrophically bad. They are adhering to policies like letting in a million or more refugees that can't possibly be screened, that will lead to more terror, not less. It's been demonstrated that within these Islamic districts, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of accomplices for the terrorists, and so they can easily move where they want, unimpeded. I read this morning that there's still 21 terrorists that were involved in the most recent attack still at large that they know of, that they have been unable to catch. So I mention this because I think without Europe, coming around to a far more rational policy and frankly aggressive policy, you're going to see these attacks continue and escalate for the foreseeable future. But in a sense, you could say, well, that's Europe's problem, and there's a limit to in terms of what the United States can actually do to intervene in that, because it's structurally an unmanageable situation as it currently stands. Now, that could change over the next couple of years. You'll probably see more liberal socialist governments thrown out as this continues. I can't imagine that Angela Merkel will survive over time. So it remains to be seen how policies will evolve. But as things stand right now, without the Europeans taking far more aggressive and competent action, this will just continue. But there are other issues where, the fact that you cite cutting off monetary backing for the terrorists, it's not going to be so easy. We've just signed an agreement with Iran that will release hundreds of billions of dollars, and they are known to be funding terrorists as we speak. A French naval vessel just caught a vessel coming from Iran, this is just in the last few days, full of grenade launchers and other kinds of weapons, heading to aid the Houthis. And it was Saudi Arabia, frankly, who's who's made a big deal about this, and understandably so. So the Iranians are completely reconstructed, and the worry remains, in my mind, that at some point, one or more of these terrorists will get hold of a dirty bomb, and wherever they explode that, the diplomatic consequences that will follow will be difficult to manage, to say the least. So on the one hand, I think Europe needs to change itself in terms of how they approach this problem, with perhaps U.S. guidance or U.S. aid or some U.S. leadership. But unless they do it themselves, it's not going to work. On the other hand, we have just signed an agreement that will make it more difficult to control the flow of funds to terrorists in the Middle East. Certain of our allies are outraged by this, including Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others. The United Arab Emirates, to list a few. So that, if a Republican president is elected, perhaps the treaty will be overturned. But all of that remains to be seen.
Let me ask you.
I see kind of two. Yeah, go ahead.
I need to ask you guys. Basically, you seem to think that Remy seems to think that what's in place now is sufficient to ward off future terrorism, or at least to get it on the downslope, at least to get it decreasing. And you seem to think that it is insufficient what we've got in place. So what do you think we should go?
I am talking about terror in the United States, and he's addressing terror in Europe. I would have given a different response if we were talking about Europe. The intelligence services over there just are not set up to handle the Schengen zone, and their capabilities simply are not where they need to be.
Okay, so what do you recommend going forward? Let's say for Europe.
For Europe, I believe that an intelligence apparatus that is commensurate with the existence of the Schengen zone is the only possible way forward, and also far greater investment in intelligence services that countries have, other than the UK and France, have made so far, is really the only way forward. Everyone needs to carry their own weight, and if you're going to have transnational institutions, you need to have transnational intelligence.
Okay, Rick?
Well, I think the Schengen zone needs to be shut down. I think that policy is completely unworkable. I think the policy toward the refugees needs to be reversed, and quickly. And I think the intelligence activities of Europe broadly obviously need to be improved. I mean, there's real incompetence there, as Remy rightly points out, and that's a relatively easy fix, frankly. But the other underlying problems of this vast increase in refugees coming into the country, the fact that the Schengen zone is starting to shut down, actually, in practice, but that formally needs to be shut down as quickly as possible, because you need border checks wherever you can have them. You need border checks.
Go ahead.
I would argue, however, that Europe is a continent built on ideas. Ever since 1945, the project of European integration has been one of the great successes. I think historically, worldwide, I mean, it's been unbelievable what the continent has been able to do. And a policy towards refugees that is generous is part and parcel of that success. Germany may have taken things a bit far, but at the very least, it's putting its money where its mouth is. Now it's up to them to make the situation sustainable. Obviously, it could lead to some problems, but as of yet, we have not seen it to be the case that refugees have been the ones who are the majority of these terrorist attackers. These are disaffected nationals. Although some supposed refugees may have been involved, there were two out of the total number. So it's important not to give up your most dearly held beliefs in the face of, of a challenge such as this.
Okay, I gotta stop you there. We're out of time, and I want to thank you guys for participating, and we'll see you all again next week on the next episode of the Philosophical Angle program.